Hey everybody, we're going to get into the 1960s today. I hope you enjoyed last week's civil rights dive, and I hope that you uh, start seeing some connections between both the civil rights movement and the movements that we're talking about in the 1960s. All right, so let's get into it. When we talk about the 1960s, I think that a lot of people have a very stereotypical understanding of it. If I were to ask you to dress up, like when we do the dress up days for the 1960s, I think everybody shows up in the hippie kind of tie dye outfits. But there's a lot more to the 1960s. You're going to see a transformation over the 1960s. It's really that decade that kind of takes the United States from that conservative 1950s to a very different and very a much more informal 1970s. And so this is something that really we see the beginnings of what are known as the culture wars, and those will pick up again in the 1980s. All right, and the 1960s is really defined by one man in a lot of ways. Or actually, I guess two men: JFK, who starts the 1960s as president, and then LBJ, who takes over, and then the two big events in LBJ's presidency: the passage of the Civil Rights and the Great Society, and then of course the Vietnam War. And so when we talk about LBJ, understand that, as historians say, he's half a great president. When you look at the domestic side of LBJ's presidency, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and the attack on Jim Crow and the getting rid of Jim Crow, that and then of course you add onto that all of the elements of the Great Society that we'll talk about. That's an amazing, progressive agenda that's very successful in a lot of ways. And then on the other side, when you look at his foreign affairs and you look at the legacy of Vietnam, I think that's when you start questioning, what's going on with Johnson? How do we understand him as a president? And we're not going to dive deeply into that, but understand that you can, if you want to, dive into that, because LBJ is an interesting character. The number of stories, if we were in class, that I would tell you about LBJ is quite fascinating. He is just a unique individual. He comes from Texas, so he's born and bred in Texas, and he, unlike JFK, he's not this young, idealistic, optimistic person, but he's pragmatic and he understands how to get things passed. JFK could give really good speeches, but LBJ could actually get the laws passed. And so Kennedy would be nothing without LBJ, because Kennedy's legacy would have died quickly after he died, because nothing really would have lasted, right? Just some really great speeches. But LBJ was able to get passed through Congress the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. He was able to get these the Great Society passed through, and so that's going to help actually lift up JFK's reputation, because a lot of people give JFK credit for Lyndon Johnson's successes. But as we go through, understand that LBJ is put into an interesting situation. He comes in as president after a very popular president was assassinated. All right, and as he comes in, the Vietnam, the issues in Vietnam are already heating up. Civil rights has been, raging for almost a decade at this point, with very little movement from either Eisenhower or JFK in terms of civil rights. And so LBJ is coming into an America that was changing dramatically and changing quickly. And he was able to work through it to an extent. And then, of course, hits up against the Vietnam War. And that's going to help destroy his political career and his presidency. A couple of big things that we should know about LBJ, besides, the major accomplishments that we'll talk about today, will be his use of political ads and television to help propel him to victory in the 1964 election. We're going to watch one of the most famous ads. It's called the Daisy ad. It was used only once. It was so disturbing to some people who watched it. But this becomes kind of a hallmark, a landmark political ad is one that we still talk about in a lot of ways. So we're going to watch Daisy ad, and we'll talk about the 1964 election. Then we'll get into Johnson's legacy, and then we'll hit up the political movements, and we'll be done with the 1960s.
Children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
All right, so that was the Daisy ad. And here he is. He's talking about his opponent. He doesn't even mention his opponent. It's Barry Goldwater. But he's talking about his opponent, and basically he's calling his opponent a warmonger, that if you were to elect Barry Goldwater, that it would be nuclear war, and we'd all die, and this young girl picking her flowers and counting horribly would die as well. And so it was a very disturbing ad for a lot of people. And the election of 1964 will become even more important as we get closer to 1980, and we'll talk about that with our 1970s lecture. But 1964 election is a landmark election for a couple of reasons, the Daisy ad being one of them. But when you look at it, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Johnson riding the wave of popularity after Kennedy's assassination, riding the wave of popularity with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, will win a major landslide victory. 61% of the United States will vote for Johnson. 91% of the electoral vote will go to Johnson. The only states that he does not get would be Arizona. That's Barry Goldwater's state. And then, of course, the Deep South. I wonder why the Deep South wouldn't vote for Johnson after signing the Civil Rights Act. Okay. So just understand that this is a huge landslide victory, which gives a mandate for Johnson to go in 65, 66, and 67 and push through a lot of very progressive reforms. And he is the next in a line of Democratic presidents, and they line him up, and they, even you can see in the poster here, they are trying to connect Johnson to a progressive legacy. So when we look at the different programs that Democratic presidents had pushed through in the 20th century, you have Woodrow Wilson's ideas of new freedom, and then FDR's New Deal, of course, and then Truman comes in with his Fair Deal, and then Kennedy with his New Frontier, and then finally Johnson with the Great Society. And when you think of the Great Society, I want you to think of the term war on poverty. Johnson, unlike the previous progressive administrations, Democratic presidents, I really thought that the biggest thing that needed to change was the poverty levels in the United States. He didn't understand, with so much affluence, why there was so much poverty, and a lot of his Great Society was focused on trying to get people jobs and get people better paying jobs and get them to work, so that you could end poverty. So when you look at the Great Society, of course, you have the civil rights accomplishments with the Civil Rights Act, which eliminates segregation in public businesses and interstate commerce. And then you have the Voting Rights Act, which gets rid of a lot of those old voting restrictions, like the literacy test and the poll tax and things of that nature. He will help expand Social Security. His biggest accomplishments as far as social programs will be the creation of Medicaid and Medicare. If you don't know Medicaid and Medicare, that's the government provided health care insurance, and so Medicare is for the elderly and Medicaid is for the impoverished, for the lower socioeconomic. And you can remember that you care for the old and you you aid the poor, right? So Medicaid is for lower socioeconomic, and Medicare is for the elderly. All right, he creates a cabinet department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to kind of tackle the urban crisis that had happened because of white flight in the 1950s, as white Americans and businesses move out of the cities and into the suburbs. That leaves a dearth of capital and money in the cities, and it creates slum and ghetto conditions in some of the inner cities. And so housing and urban development was created to help create affordable housing and to help develop urban areas to benefit Americans living in the cities. Head Start is a pre-K program for people in the lower socioeconomic range to help give them a better education. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. All right. And so this is a big part of LBJ's accomplishments, and it will reduce poverty. It will reduce the income gap. It will reduce a lot of the issues that you see. It doesn't get rid of them. All right. Though you don't actually get rid of poverty, but you are starting to see some reduction in those gaps and in those conditions. He also created a lot of different organizations like Job Corps and Volunteers in America and things of that nature to help people gain new skills and get new jobs, and to volunteer to help make America better. So to get into areas that are underserved, whether the rural or the urban areas, and help people in those areas have more opportunity. And so here you see a lot of great programs and great ideas being put out there to help equalize the opportunities and create equity in the United States. But it's all going to be undercut, because even as Johnson is pushing these great society ideas, with one hand, the rest of him is focused on something much bigger. All right. And that is the Vietnam War. Now, we're not going to get into the Vietnam War right now, just because the Vietnam War is so big and so important that we have to give it its own time. So next week we're going to do Vietnam and Nixon, and we're going to watch the destruction of confidence in the American system. And I think we're dealing with that destruction of confidence right now in a lot of ways. And so we're going to give that week to them next week. But understand that the Great Society was a program that could work if LBJ had focused strictly on it. And I think this cartoon says that the train of the U.S. economy, which is pulling the Great Society along with it, is burning all of it to help fight the Vietnam War. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that we should get out of this. That the idea that Johnson really had some great ideas as far as trying to fix the inequities of society, but most of his attention on a lot of the money that was spent by the U.S. government was actually spent in Vietnam, and that's going to derail the Great Society. The big part of the 1960s that a lot of people want to talk about is the culture wars, the kind of revolution that happens at home. So you have your big revolutions, the civil rights movement and Vietnam, and that's creating a lot of activism in society. All right, as more and more young baby boomers are coming into their young adulthood, and they start becoming more and more active, because you have these huge monumental things that are going on. You have the civil rights movement, which had been active since the 1950s, and had gained momentum with Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, SNCC, and SCLC, and also all the other parts of the civil rights movement had really, and then you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 64, 65, and this is pushing young people to be active. At the same time, young people are becoming more active because also they're being affected by this war that is drafting hundreds of thousands of them into the military, and forcing them to fight in a country that a lot of them didn't know couldn't find on the map before. And so there's this massive activism that's going to help feed a lot of other movements as well. right? Because, and all these other movements have origins that are completely opposite and completely separate from the civil rights movement and Vietnam. But because the civil rights movement in Vietnam were so big and so massive and so engaging with the American public, that this activism will feed into these other movements, and these other movements will benefit. All right. So when we look at it, we're looking at things like the growth of feminism, right? In the early 1960s, Betty Friedan will write a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in The Feminine Mystique, she puts out the problem that has no answer, right? The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was strange, stirring a sense of dissatisfaction and yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask, even of herself, the silent question, is this all? And what Betty Friedan is doing there is she is voicing a very real concern that a lot of women had, that Cornelius Minor, his teacher in New York, had a really great way of understanding this. After World War II, women were almost deified. They were put on a pedestal, like they are fragile and they need protection. And this idea of the domestic sphere was created. This push to the domestic sphere was really enacted in the 1940s and 50s, as women were saying, listen, you did your duty during World War II. Now go and be a housewife, and you're gonna live in the suburbs. You're gonna have 3 children, and the husband's gonna make all this money, and everything's gonna be great. You have 2 Fords, right? And you're almost deifying women and the role of women in society as homemakers. But what that does is that takes away agency and choice and individuality for a lot of women. And women like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and others will become miserable with this way of life, with this conformity, with this suburban life of the 1950s. And you're going to see out of that distress, discomfort, anger of situation for women in the United States will come this second wave of feminism that will lead to women getting involved in the civil rights movement. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 will include that businesses cannot discriminate because of sex, not just because of race, but also because of sex. All right, you have the creation of the National Organization of Women in 1966. You have more and more women starting to enroll in school, especially the baby boomers, the young women. All right, you have women joining the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements, and you're going to see women start pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. And this is going to create a huge swell of desire for women to gain equality, and that's really the focus of second wave feminism, is to gain that equality. And of course, that not every woman was on board, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. That there were women who resisted this kind of push, and they wanted things to stay the same, status quo, as they say. But second wave feminism with Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem is going to be a huge movement that you could research. Other things you can research would be the New Left. As more and more young college kids come into political activism, you're going to see them pushing further and further left. You see the free speech movement starting in the California state schools, like UC Berkeley in 1964, arguing against this kind of parenting, this kind of censorship that they were feeling from the colleges. A lot of times in the colleges in the 1940s and 50s, kind of treated students as children, without a lot of freedom and without a lot of say in curriculum and in coursework and stuff like that. And so here you see the push by young activists at these colleges for more say in how the university is run. You also have activist groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, who organize on the college campuses and fight for more democracy. They'll fight to end war. They'll fight to secure economic and racial justice. And they put out a statement, a manifesto called the Port Huron Statement, saying this is what we desire. They'll organize teach-ins, like, so say, for example, during the Vietnam War, not a lot of people understood or knew anything about the history of Vietnam. They didn't understand why the United States was there. So they'd organize a teach-in. Basically, they'd shut down the college, and a professor would lead a class for hours on the history of Vietnam. And this was against the curriculum that had been set forth by the college. And so this was a teach-in. Then you had the more radical movement out of the Students for Democratic Society, and that would be the Weathermen. And the Weathermen tended to use violence. They would use pipe bombs, and they would send these pipe bombs to empty buildings and blow them up. This kind of an anarchist move to threaten violence in order to gain change. And it wasn't super successful, but it was there. All right. These young activists, some of them will drop out, some of them will not go to college, but a lot of them will be lured by narcotics and drugs and rock and roll, and they'll be lured by the writings of the transcendentals of the 1840s to this idea of just rejecting life, right? So you have a growing counterculture by the end of the 60s, in which what we call the hippies, this counterculture, they are going to argue that mainstream society has lost its way. It is dead. And so they are going to desire a way of pulling away from that mainstream society. And we've seen this a couple of times. We saw it with the Transcendentals in the 1840s. We see it now. We saw it in the 1950s with the Beats. We saw it with the utopian movements in the antebellum period, this idea that mainstream society was lost, and that in order to be okay, that you needed to remove yourself from that society. You needed to go counter to what that culture was. That's why it's called the counterculture. And so San Francisco will be the hotspot for the counterculture. You know, the Haight-Ashbury district. They'll host a Summer of Love, which is there's a fascinating documentary from the American Experience on PBS about the Summer of Love. But basically all these hippies and counterculture youth will come to San Francisco trying to basically live in a very different style and different way of life. You're going to hear about the hippies creating communes, riding around in psychedelic buses. They're going to be experimenting beyond just marijuana. They're going to get into LSD, acid and and ecstasy and stuff like that, and really get into these kind of mind-altering drugs as a way of trying to experience a different reality. This will culminate in 1969 with Woodstock, which becomes like the hippie, the hippie movement, or the hippie, peak, when this big music festival in New York. And this becomes, iconic of the 1960s, although it was a very small group. There were very few people that were part of the counterculture, but it does show up, and it is fairly fascinating to go and study. All right. Feeding off of the civil rights movement, not only will you have feminism, but you also have the Chicano movement. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta will be two of the main leaders of the Chicano movement, and they are mainly known for organizing farm workers and pushing farm workers, which are in large percent Hispanic Americans in the southwestern portion of the United States, to unionize and to fight against big farms and big companies. All right. And they'll start pushing for the rights of Hispanic Americans, and we'll see a slight movement, a slight success there. Same with the American Indian movement. While Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta tended to get a lot of their influence from Martin Luther King Jr. and this idea of peaceful resistance and boycotting, the American Indian movement tended to use more Black Power, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael type tactics, Black Panther type tactics. They would occupy major cultural and heritage sites like Wounded Knee. They'll go and occupy Wounded Knee, and they'll also occupy. It's in San Francisco. That's the prison out in San Francisco now. Alcatraz, sorry. They'll occupy Alcatraz, demanding a return of native land and a return of money and land to Native American tribes that had been taken from them from all the lost and bad treaties. Okay. Asian Americans also have it's a smaller movement, but you will see a movement for Asian American civil rights. There are a couple of things going on here. First off, you have the legacy of internment. All right, Japanese Americans fighting for the apology and the reparations from internment, and you also have Vietnam. All right, you have Vietnam, and both of these will create a lot of anti-Asian racism in the United States. On a very interesting opposite note to that, the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, will also create a model minority myth for Asian Americans, right? And it kind of goes like this: like African Americans demand freedom and equality, and then white Americans will say, well, Asian Americans are okay, and look at it, they suffered all that stuff, all the racism of the 19th and 20th century, and they're fine. And so what it is white Americans lifting up a minority group with the model minority myth in order to divide and conquer against another minority group. And this is, again, going back to basic power structures. This is how people in power keep powers, by dividing those who they have power over and keeping them from uniting. And so the model minority myth, of course, is detrimental to Asian Americans. This is similar to the racism of the Chinese Exclusion Act or the internment or Vietnam. All right, because what you're doing is you're creating a system in which there is no agency, no individuality, and no ability to be who you are. And so you're going to see Asian Americans really fight against that with the Asian American Political Alliance and the Third World Liberation Front. People like Richard Aoki, who is a civil rights activist for Asian Americans, also a member of the Black Panthers, will put out, statements and speeches in which he basically lays out what he considers America's past wrongs. We Asian Americans believe that American society has been and still is fundamentally a racist society, and that historically we have accommodated ourselves to this society in order to survive. We Asian Americans support all non-white liberation movements and believe that all minorities, in order to be truly liberated, must have complete control over the political, economic, and social institutions within their respective communities. We Asian Americans oppose the imperialist policies being pursued by the American government. So there's a lot of anti-Vietnam War, there's a lot of anti-racism that comes out of the Asian American Political Alliance. Another big political movement that comes in the late 1960s and into the 70s is the LGBT movement. All right, now gay rights, really starting in the 1930s and going through the 40s and 50s, gay Americans had to hide themselves in order to gain any benefits or to keep themselves from jail. There was a lot of laws and a lot of morality police that were around trying to stop LGBT from living their life. And so what you're going to see in the late 60s is a movement from the Gay Liberation Front to basically come out. And you're going to start seeing this come out movement. And this is going to spark a lot of counter reaction. At one point, a police raid in New York on the Stonewall Inn, which was a bar, a gay and trans bar, will lead to the Stonewall riots, in which LGBT Americans basically say no more to the hatred and the brutality that was being put upon the LGBT community. And this really kind of doesn't start the gay rights movement, but it does ignite it even larger. It does grow it. It does give it, a boost. And out of that comes a large LGBT movement that will take off in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s will hit flat because of the HIV crisis. And we'll talk more about that in the 1980s. And then from the 90s and onward, we see a reignition of the gay rights movement, which will lead us to the legalization of gay marriage and the striking down of anti-sodomy laws. All right, and I think for a lot of people, it's hard to understand this. Is only 2020. The last anti-sodomy law, which is fundamentally an anti-gay law, was struck down in 2003. So only 17 years ago. In some states, it was illegal to be gay up until 2003. So just understand that. And even now, I mean, you're going to still see this movement is continuing. You're going to see that this movement continue to grow, because this is still something that society is debating. All right. A lot of these civil rights and a lot of these rights movements are going to find a ally in the court. The Supreme Court becomes very active in the 1960s under Chief Justice Earl Warren. Under that, you're going to get voting rights restored, or at least attempt to restore, in Baker versus Carr, in which basically the Supreme Court says that one vote should equal one vote, that one person should equal one vote, and they're going to try to fight against gerrymandering. Not very well, but it's there. All right. You're going to get the rights of the defendants. So you've heard the Miranda rights. So that's Miranda versus Arizona. Basically, if you are accused of a crime, you have certain rights, and they have to tell you what those rights are. And then Gideon versus Wainwright. No matter if you're accused of a civil or criminal, issue, you have the right to a lawyer. And if you can't afford one, they'll provide you with one. So these are the rights of the defendant. And then, of course, the expansion of the Bill of Rights into the states. So Engel versus Vitale, which makes it illegal for a school official to lead the school in prayer, and to make that a requirement. And then Griswold versus Connecticut, which outlaws states from denying access to birth control because of a right to privacy. And this is going to be important because this right to privacy will be used in the 1970s for a very important case, Roe v. Wade. So in the 1970s, you'll see a lot of continuation of what we saw here. In the 1960s, Earl Warren will take over for Warren Burger will take over for Earl Warren. Now, Warren Burger is a conservative Republican, but even under him, you're going to see a liberalism in the courts. Furman versus Georgia will end the death penalty. That will be overturned a couple years later, but there was a brief moment in the United States when the death penalty was declared unconstitutional. Nixon versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court says, no, Nixon, you cannot commit crimes. University of California versus Bakke, which is a case that deals with affirmative action and whether or not colleges can use race as part of their admission process. And the court says, yes, you can. You just can't have quotas. And then Roe v. Wade, which legalizes abortion for women due to this idea that women have the right to privacy between her and her doctor, and that doctors and women can make the decision on abortion. All right, and so these are all extremely liberal and activist cases that occur even under a very conservative Supreme Court justice. Now, for African Americans in the 1970s, you're going to see a movement towards affirmative action and economic equality. You will have more and more African Americans gaining political office in the Congress and eventually the Senate in the 90s and the O's. You're going to see Hank Aaron beat Babe Ruth and become the home run champion in baseball. And you're going to see, and you also have the creation of a miniseries called Roots, which will help change the narrative. A lot of white Americans were taught that African American slaves were happy and enjoyed their slavery, and Roots will really kind of open a lot of people's eyes to the brutality of slavery. Shirley Chisholm, I think, is an important figure to know about. She is an African American congresswoman from New York, and she will be the first African American woman to run for president in 1972. And she becomes an icon of what happens whenever you see the breakdown of these institutional obstacles that are thrown up for African Americans, and she gets into Congress and she becomes an advocate for civil rights and for equality. She has a lot of influence on later politicians. Second wave feminism will continue in the 1970s with a push for the Equal Rights Amendment. You see the creation of Miss Magazine with Gloria Steinem as the editor, and the push for abortion and birth control rights with Roe v. Wade. But even with this push towards the Equal Rights Amendment, you'll have a counter push to stop the ERA by people like Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly will head up the Heritage, what becomes the Heritage Foundation, and others, as a way of trying to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment is interesting. It was finally passed by the requisite number of states, and it'll be interesting to see if the U.S. government will actually put the Equal Rights Amendment on the books. Right now, the Equal Rights Amendment is not officially in the Constitution. All right. Last thing about the 60s is environmentalism. Now, we've seen environmentalism before, but it was more progressive. Like in the progressive era, the progressives there's a preservation versus conservation. It was very much the government would decide whether or not land was used and how much of it was used. In the 1960s, environmentalism really becomes a grassroots effort. It comes from the bottom up. It's people who are arguing that government needs to change its policy, and it really is this kind of large groundswell of movement. And so that's what we're going to see here, and it really comes from a couple of things. In 1962, Rachel Carson will write Silent Spring, and Silent Spring is a call to end pesticides. That pesticides were killing the birds, and and so it showed this interconnected nature of humanity and the world, and why our actions are so detrimental to nature, and why that's a big issue. And it's really going to open a lot of people's eyes. And then Paul Ehrlich will write a book called The Population Bomb, talking about how overpopulated the world is, and that we needed more planning, more contraception, more abortion to stop the spread of humanity, because humans were going to overrun the world and run out of needed materials and needed commodities. And then Apollo 8 in 1968 will take a picture of Earth, and I think this is the first time humans had ever really seen Earth from space in that way. And it looks so small if you look at it. Like they're coming around the moon, and it looks so small. And I think for a lot of people, this was a moment when they realized how small the Earth truly was in space and how fragile it was. And so you're going to see the movement towards, say, Earth Day. We have Earth Day coming up on Wednesday, the 22nd. It's on April 22nd every year, and that comes out of this environmentalist movement. You also have in 1969, a river catches on fire. That's never okay. When water catches on fire, it should not happen. This is in Cleveland, in Cuyahoga River. And that opens up people to, okay, what did people throw into this river to allow it to catch on fire? And so this is what you're doing. You have this environmentalist movement that starts at the colleges, starts at the people, and it rises, and you see Earth Day in April 22nd, 1970, and out of Earth Day comes a push for the Clean Air and Clean Water Act and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And this is the push that people will do to, hey, the government has to get involved to save the planet. And I think we still see a lot of this today, that most of the environmentalism still comes from the people demanding it from the government. All right, well, that's it. Those are the movements. When you look at your assignment, make sure that you pick one that you are most interested in. Do a good deep dive into it, learn more about it. Please jump onto WebEx or onto Canvas and ask me any questions you have. And I will see you. I'll see you on Wednesday when we do our live WebEx. All right, y'all have a good day. Bye.